When I first went off to college at Harvard University, my father was so excited by the idea that someday I might come back and I might be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker or something he thought would make a lot of sense. And when I came home from college and told him, "Dad, I want to study the science of happiness," he sat me down. My father is a neuroscientist at Baylor University in Texas in the United States. And he told me that the average scientific paper, the average scientific journal article, is only read on average by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear, because I know that that statistic also includes my mom. So now I'm down to 6 people who read these studies, which is an absolute travesty, because what we've been finding literally changes what it means to be human. And what I want to talk about is the work we've been doing across the globe to show how happiness could actually be the greatest competitive advantage you could possibly give to a child, to a company, and to a country, but also about how much it's a choice when we create habits based upon those ideas. But as soon as we start talking about happiness, most people get the wrong idea. They immediately start thinking about pleasure, like I'm supposed to be smiling all the time I'm at work, or life is always supposed to be fun. That's pleasure, and it's so short-lived, it wasn't worth flying all the way out here to talk about. What I want to talk about is something very different. When I got into this research, I was studying back at the divinity school, and one of the things I learned is the ancient Greeks defined happiness not as pleasure. They defined happiness as the joy you feel moving towards your potential. That definition is so important because joy is something you can experience even when life is not pleasurable. If you go for a long run, your legs might be burning, but you can feel joy as you see what your body's capable of. If you work 8 to 9 months building a new business, you're going to have long hours and high levels of stress, but you might actually see joy as you see your strengths emerge as well. I'm told even in the midst of childbirth, not high levels of pleasure all the time, but moments of joy that could actually correspond high levels of pleasure. But I think it's important because I think we're afraid of happiness as a society. As we try to create a happier world, I actually believe most of the people that we've been working with are afraid of happiness because they think if I'm too happy right now, maybe I want to push so hard to be so successful. If my kids are too happy, they're going to slack off in school. If we're too happy right now, maybe we won't fix some of the problems we need to fix in the society, like the inequality and the discrimination you were hearing about earlier today. What I want to talk about, that's what pleasure does. Joy does the exact opposite to the human brain. Joy, we've actually found, turns on the brain to its highest possible level, raising every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for, tripling our creativity on problem solving, and allowing us to actually achieve greater levels of success than we were able to beforehand. The problem is not only how our mindset is about happiness, but how we practice it as well. Last year, I was invited to speak out in Northern California to CEOs of top software companies. All CEOs of these top software companies you probably use on a daily basis. And afterwards, one of the CEOs offered to drive me to the airport after my talk to talk about how we could cascade this research out throughout his global company. And I was so excited about this opportunity. I got into this guy's really nice sports car. I don't even know what it was. It was fancy. The doors went up instead of out. And I got in, I put on my seatbelt. He got on the other side, immediately started talking to me about how his company had been growing so quickly over the past 3 years, his stress levels had been skyrocketing. And as he was speeding towards the airport and weaving all over the roads, I was holding on for dear life. And at one point, this bell was going off in his car, the seatbelt bell, and eventually it stopped going off. It got tired. And I turned to him and I said, "I'm sorry, but you don't wear seatbelts?" He said, "No, Shawn, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist." I was like, "Oh, no." No, you're an idiot. But I'd love to work with you. Optimism is great for a lot of things, but it won't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop reality from impinging upon us. That's irrational optimism. And when we sugarcoat the present, we make poor decisions for the future. When we sugarcoat the present and put on rose-colored glasses for the way that we see the world, people stop believing in your leadership. When you start talking as irrational optimists about what the world is experiencing, all the pessimists you know around you will start mentioning all the negatives to try and move you back to reality. What we need and I think is at the heart of why we're having this conference in the first place, is what sociologists call rational optimism. Rational optimism does not start with a sugar-coated version of the world. It starts with realism. But throughout that entire process, you maintain the belief that our behavior will eventually matter if linked to the right people around us. That seems to be the definition of what I've been watching all day long, which is you start with realism, but you maintain the belief that our behavior matters if linked to the right people around us. And the world is starting to change around these ideas. My very first talk was in 2007, taking the research I was doing at Harvard in the labs where we can control all the variables, and I took it out to a large Swiss bank at the beginning of the banking crisis. And they didn't realize how upset the bankers were, the banker who introduced me was, and he got up and he said, well, we don't have bonuses for everyone, but here's a talk on happiness from a guy from America. So you can imagine the cold response in that room. But as soon as we started talking about the research, about how we know exactly how to restart forward progress when we believe that happiness is not a choice anymore, or that we've lost our leverage points of merely pay, it turns out that I couldn't even get to the coffee at the middle of the talk during the break because they were so focused on what specifically we could be doing next. Now we're actually finding the conversation has changed. I've now worked with half of the Fortune 100 companies across the world and in 51 countries. And what we're finding now is I'm not having to convince them that happiness is important to the bottom line. I'm no longer having to convince them that happiness is the greatest competitive advantage in the modern economy. The question is, how do we achieve that within our world? But it's interesting, given all the talks you've heard today, because we live in the most socially connected time in our history. I did a study at Harvard, the largest one that's ever been done there, on trying to predict what would create greater levels of happiness. And the greatest predictor of happiness and success at Harvard was your social connection, the breadth, depth, and meaning in your social relationships. Yet, in the midst of social media, we should have that to the nth degree, but we're not finding that at all. In fact, we're finding depression rates have doubled. We're finding that people are increasingly on antidepressants. We're finding that people are struggling to find happiness. And I think that there's a way forward that's actually crucial to helping us improve our well-being, our business outcomes, and our educational outcomes worldwide. In order to show you that, I want to take a leap of faith and do an experiment with you here today. I was nervous about doing this experiment, but they convinced me backstage that I have to try it, and I'm just fascinated as a researcher. You don't have to do any of my experiments today. I'm not allowed to bring consent forms to talks anymore after the electric shock problem we had a couple times ago. But if you're willing to participate, all I need you to do is to please partner up with someone that you're sitting next to here today. Please partner up into pairs of 2. The only caveat is I'm legally required to tell you that you cannot partner up with someone that you're married to for this experiment, or that you wish you were married to. So move around if that's a problem for you. So please partner up into pairs very quickly. And introduce yourself if you don't know that person. This person's probably a world leader. So now that you've met this person, here's what I need you to do. This is a very simple experiment. The person sitting closest to this side of the room over here, you're person number 1 for this experiment, closest to this wall. Person that's furthest from that wall, you're person number 2 in the group. There should be a 1 and a 2 in each group. If you're front to back, the person closest to stage is person number 1. If neither of those apply, you can pick one person to be number 1. So raise your hand if you're person number 1 for this experiment. Well, it's working so far. Raise your hand if you're person number 2. Okay, that's not the experiment. I have to do this now because I did this experiment on Wall Street in the United States with a struggling bank, and it literally took them 5 minutes to figure out who number 1 in the group was, which explains their leadership problem. But here's what's interesting. So how many of you, by the way, are psychology friends? You read a lot of psychology books, you have a psychology degree, you like raising your hand, so a couple people. So for my psychology friends, this is the emotional prime of the experiment. And for everyone else, this is nothing. Over the course of your life, you've taken your genes and you built those genes up through your self-discipline and your self-control. You're able to pass the classes you needed to in school, to get into the jobs you want to apply yourselves to your work and to your families. What I'd like you to do is use all that self-discipline and control that you've been cultivating for decades, and I'd like you to use it to control your behavior for just 7 seconds with your partner if you can. At 8 seconds, you can do whatever you'd like, to or with your partner, but for 7 seconds, we need you to control yourself. So person number one, what we ask you to do in this experiment, is to not get angry with person number two when they do to you what I'm about to tell them to do to you. Person number one, don't get angry, don't get sad. Please, please don't cry like the group a couple weeks ago. That was so embarrassing. That was at the Pentagon in the United States. So basically what I need you to do is to do nothing. So person number one and two, please turn and face one another. Person number one, make sure you're within striking distance of person number two. I see some of you taking off your glasses. That's a great idea. And person number one, just go neutral on the inside. Try to feel no emotions and try and think no thoughts, which at this point in the conference might be very easy for you. Then person number one, don't move your hands from this point in the experiment, even to defend yourself from person number two. And person number one, just go neutral on your face. Show zero emotions on your face. No fear, no flinching, no frustration, zero emotion. Once you're ready, person number one, you're using your decades of self-discipline and control to control your thoughts, your emotions, your hands, and your face. Then person number two, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, person number two, please smile genuinely and warmly, but directly up into the eyes of person number one while looking at them as warmly and as deeply as possible. Ready, go. And stop. So I'm sorry, we're going to need to do that one more time. I didn't realize when I paired you up that person number two is going to be so much better at it than person number one. Let's just switch it around. Now, my few psychology friends know you never repeat a psychology experiment with deception in it, but let's just try it. Flip it around. Person number two, go neutral on the inside, feel no emotions, think no thoughts. Person number one, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, it's your turn for retaliation. Please smile genuinely and warmly, directly into the eyes while looking at them warmly and deeply. Ready, go. And stop. I love that you're clapping, but I don't know why. You were terrible at it. So success in this experiment, success meant that you did not smile for the full 7 seconds. Failure meant you smiled when I asked you not to today. Please raise your hand if you failed miserably in this experiment by smiling when you were not supposed to be smiling here at the World Government Summit. Look around at your peers. That's incredibly high. Raise your hand if you successfully did what I asked you to for the full 7 seconds by not smiling. I don't have time to count all the liars in such a big room, but here's what we found. I've done this experiment now in 51 countries across the globe. 80 to 85% of people worldwide cannot control themselves for the 7 seconds of this experiment. This experiment, which in this form is predictive of nothing, illustrates something that transforms what it means to be human, and we never get research like this. What we found is if you put me into a brain scan, an fMRI brain scan, scan my brain while I'm smiling, small portions of my brain will show activation saying, Shawn, you're smiling, which we knew had happened, I'm smiling. But if I stop smiling, but you keep scanning and you flash an image of one of you smiling at me, small portions of my brain called mirror neurons will start to activate. And when those mirror neurons activate, they say, Shawn, you're smiling. But I'm not smiling, you're smiling. But before I can stop myself, my brain drops a neurochemical called dopamine into my system, raising my levels of happiness and enjoyment and causing my face to move into a smile when it's not supposed to. You might have seen these this afternoon if you were looking at your partner while you were smiling at them and their lips were quivering while they were trying not to smile. That's weird. That shouldn't be happening. Now, what's happening there is their mirror systems are fighting against their motor system. The brain already thinks it's smiling. It's like, what's the problem here, face? You've seen these before. If you've ever spoken at a conference and one person yawns and then other people yawn, that's not because you're boring. That can't possibly be it. What's happening there is as you see people in your visual field start to yawn, your brain tells you you are the one that's yawning. And you can pick up the fatigue response of someone sitting in the back of the room. Where this gets amazing is if you have 15 strangers all waiting for a plane, they don't even know they're part of an experiment, they're just waiting at their gate, and you introduce an undercover researcher to stand in the middle of the 15 people in a 5-meter radius, and the undercover researcher just begins to bounce nervously in place, tap his foot on the floor impatiently, and look at his watch with a frown on his face. Within 2 minutes of waiting for that plane, depending on the study worldwide, on average, 7 to 12 of the 15 individuals will unconsciously start bouncing nervously in place and or tapping their foot on the ground and or looking at their watch 4 times in a 2-minute span of time. If you don't believe me, this is one of the experiments you can try out yourself the next time you get on a plane, if you want to spread stress and negativity to the people on your plane, which is why I always do this one in a different gate than mine. But the reason I love this experiment is because it shows us that not only do smiles and yawns spread, but it turns out negativity, stress, uncertainty, and anxiety, we can pick up like secondhand smoke. You don't even have to be the one smoking to have the negative health effects. Same thing is true with how other people's brains at negative process your world. Now, as soon as I tell people that, they immediately think, here are the people I'm cutting out of my life. I'm not hanging out with that person anymore. I'm defriending her on Facebook. And when I get home from this conference, I'm not even going to look at this person, which is awkward because I'm married to them. If that was somebody's approach, what they're doing is they're eliminating social connection. And we came here for the opposite. What we came here for was to see how powerful we are. This is the biological underpinnings of it. Because what it meant was, we've been studying you wrong. Humans don't process the world. We co-process the world with other people. It turns out while there's no wires connecting our brains actually, in a sense, wirelessly process the world together. We're wirelessly connected as human beings, which means if we drop single positive habits into our leaders at an organization, into a government, into a school, we can watch the brains around them tip towards the belief that change is possible for them. We did this at a group of hospitals in the United States. Post a hurricane, Hurricane Katrina, that came through and devastated a community, we came in to work with the hospitals. And hospitals have a very difficult time. Their customers are patients who are sick, and you just surrounded them with more sick people or that are injured. How do you raise customer experience in the midst of this? So we went into the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain to find out what they were doing to raise happiness there. And what we found was they were doing something called the 10-5 way, which many of you might know about. That if you walk within 10 feet of an employee at the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain, the employees are trained to make eye contact and smile at you. Within 5 feet, they're trained to say hello. It's called the 10-5 way, and it's actually really fun to go in and out of those spheres with them, even if you're not staying there. What we did was, we took that idea to the group of hospitals. We trained 11,000 doctors, nurses, and staff to do the Ritz-Carlton 10-5 way. Now, those of you who've tried to create positive change, you know you get pushback. Some of the doctors said, you hired me to save people's lives. I make you a ton of money. Don't tell me how to walk up and down the hallway. I'm not doing the stupid smiling initiative from HR. So we said, you don't have to. You opt into this program. But we surrounded people with 11,000 people who are making eye contact and smiling at them. And we're socialized to reciprocate. So if you get into a hotel elevator and someone says hello to you, you don't slam up against the side of the elevator. You usually say hello back and then pull out your phone. The same thing was happening in the hospital hallways. The doctors, nurses, and staff were all doing this 10-5 way. That's not interesting yet. We haven't gotten to the patients. The patients coming into the hospital never learned the 10-5 way. They never went through a training. But it turns out, as you walk into that building and you videotape them, you actually watch these patients unconsciously learn the script of how I'm supposed to interact with other people. And within 10 feet, they make eye contact and smile. Within 5 feet, they say hello. What's amazing is what happens next. I studied their key performance indicators 6 months later, and the group of hospitals that adopted it had a significant rise in the number of patients they cared for. The likelihood of patients to refer that hospital skyrocketed, and the doctors' engagement levels were the highest in a decade. That's a 1-second free behavioral change that resulted in tens of millions of dollars for the hospital, better quality of care, more people cared for, and greater levels of happiness. What we got interested in is, what if we did this elsewhere? What if we did this with schools? What if we did this with companies? I started going into organizations to see if we could start to make those changes. I went into a large insurance company in the United States, and we did a 2-day training where we taught them about how happiness could actually be a choice and what habits you needed to do to create that. We tracked them over 18 months, And it turns out that their profits rose nearly 50% in that period of time. It took them 30 years to get to $600 million in revenue, and the very next year they were $950 million with no new hires. They found that their engagement scores were the highest of any group there, but one of the leaders there said, we need to get this into our schools if we're really going to see positive change. So he went into the poorest school in one of the poorest states in the United States, and we went in and we did a positive training there. With the lunch staff that gave food, we did the Ritz-Carlton 10-5-way experiment. We had the bus drivers write positive notes to each of the students in their bus as they then go home to the parents. Turns out the bus drivers were the front-facing part of the school. We've been tracking them now for 5 years, and we just got the research back that when we invested in happiness at the poorest school in Iowa, which has a lot of problems, there's extreme amounts of poverty, there's unemployment, but we invested in happiness there. And what we found was that their standardized test scores improved by nearly 25%. They went from a bottom 10% school to a 95% attendance rate. And for the first time in history in the state, which is open enrollment, you can send your kids anywhere. For the first time ever, the kids from the rich counties were sending their kids, the parents were sending their kids to the poorest county in Iowa for a better education. They even invested in a $5 million bond afterwards to keep this going. What we realized was we had to create patterns where people, if they wanted to choose happiness, could actually create it within their life. But here's the mindset problem we had. I spent 12 years studying happiness at Harvard, and when my friends come to visit me there, the very first thing I do is I walk them into the freshman dining hall, which has these vaulted wooden ceilings and Tiffany stained glass. And they walk in there and they roll their eyes and say that this looks like something out of the movie Harry Potter, which is the magical vision of what happiness could look like. And this is from the movie, and then this is Harvard. And they see this and they say, why would you waste time studying happiness there? Why aren't you in the slums of Venezuela, or an impoverished school in Africa, or in a children's cancer ward? Since then, I've researched in all of those places. Last year, I was out at a children's hospital in the US, learning from the doctors why it is that 4-year-old children with terminal cancer are more likely to tell their parents everything's going to be okay, instead of the reverse. Why is there access to resilience in childhood that we lose in adulthood? And how do we transfer that to people who are struggling as adults? As we started putting this together, what we found was if we know how smart you are at an organization, we can only predict 25% of your job successes. 75% of your success at work was predicted based upon things we weren't teaching in school. Optimism, social connection, the way that we perceive stress. When we put it together and started measuring people, not only do we find that we could change them, but if we took a neutral sales force, raised them to positive, their sales rose by not 3 or 4%, by 37% cross-industry. We find that people work longer, they live longer, there are greater levels of happiness, lower levels of depression. The question, though, isn't happiness leading to success. The problem is, how do we get there? The first is a mindset shift. This room is incredibly successful and or wealthy. And what we've been finding is, in the midst of all this study, we found that only 10% of your long-term happiness is predicted based upon your external world. 90% of it is how you process your income. How do you process your country? How do you process your company and your family? What we found was most people think if I work harder, I'll be more successful and then I'll be happier. Think how much we do that. Think how much during this conference we think as soon as we solve all these problems, then we can start talking about happiness. As soon as my company does better, or we hit the sales target, or I have this nest egg, or as soon as I'm married, or once I have kids, or once they're in the right school, then I'll feel happier. Each time, the goalpost of success changes, and if happiness is on the opposite side of it, your brain doesn't get there. But flip it around, what we're finding is every single business and educational outcome improves when our human brain is positive first. So how do we get there? In order to study that, we had to study video games. How many people have played this video game? This is, a lot of you. This is Tetris, where shapes fall from the ceiling just like they do in real life. And you rotate those shapes around. And the goal of Tetris is to make straight lines. Harvard Medical School paid people to play it for 5 hours in a row. At the end of the experiment, they realized that they were screwing up their participants. One of the students grabbed this old professor in Harvard Yard and said, this is 3 weeks later, she said, "Professor, remember that study where you made me sit in the basement of that laboratory for 5 hours playing that game? I walked out of the experiment, met up with one of my friends, we walked into a supermarket, and she found me rearranging the bread on the shelves to make straight lines." She said, "Am I crazy?" He said, yes, you are. Please stop touching me. But it turns out She wasn't the only one who was crazy. People were dreaming about Tetris. Has anyone at the World Government Summit dreamed about Tetris? There's a couple of people. Yeah, we always get a couple of people. It depends on, if you play a game too much, it happens. For me, it was Vice City. And what happens is, as you're viewing the world, your brain starts to take on these patterns. I'm trying to go slightly quickly because they only gave me half time, but I think this is the deepest part of the talk. If you view the world through the same pattern for too long, your brain keeps that pattern even if it doesn't work for you. Same thing we found with the Tetris effect. We found at KPMG. I was working with their tax auditors, trying to make tax auditors happier. And one of the things we found is that many of these people were spending 8 to 14 hours a day reading through tax forms, looking for mistakes and errors, which made them great at their job. Then they got promoted and levels of happiness dropped. I came into work with them in December of 2008, right before one of the busiest tax seasons in history. We did a 2-day training with them. 4 months later, in the middle of the busiest tax season in history, higher levels of happiness, engagement, and job effectiveness. That's what we got to publish on the cover of Harvard Business Review. What we don't get to talk about is what happened in the control group, and that's what I wanted to share with you. In the control group, somebody came up to me and said, over the past 3 years, I've been getting about 20% less work done. I don't find happiness in my work anymore. I'm struggling to find meaning in my life. I said, I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. What have you done to fix it? He said, I've tried everything. One day at lunch, I decided not to go eat. I just sat there at my desk, and I made an Excel spreadsheet. And I was like, I don't think that's going to help your happiness at all. You should be eating. And he said, no, I realized this was impacting me at home, so I needed to open up a dialogue with my wife. So I made a list of all the things I wanted to talk to my wife about. I made a spreadsheet of all the mistakes I felt like my wife had been making in our relationship over the past 6 months, so we could work on it together. And I printed out the spreadsheet and brought this home to my ex-wife, handed this to her. I heard this guy tell the story, and what I realized was this is not a bad person. Here's someone who got stuck. He trained his brain to look for mistakes and errors, which made him great at his job, but he never trained his brain to look for the things he was grateful for or the meaning involved with the work. So when he became a leader, when he became a tax audit manager, all he could see were the problems and flaws in the system, nothing to praise or recognize. When he came home, he was treating his wife and his son like a tax form. He saw all the problems that if he could just fix them, think how much he would love them. What happens in the midst of it, as we do conservative risk analysis, as we look at the problems facing this world, even at the World Government Summit, as we watch the news and see the negative first and not all the positives that are occurring in the world, like this summit, our brains start to get very good at seeing the negative, which means that as we look at the world, an eclipse occurs. Because as we look at the world, our brain can process the negative, but it takes away the resources from the part of your brain that was processing the positive. We know if I work out my bicep, it gets stronger. Stop working out, it atrophies, it gets smaller. Same thing with cognitive ability. If we're not practicing optimism and hope and gratitude, even here at the World Government Summit, that part of our brain starts to atrophy and we get an eclipsed version of this world. But we can build it back out, and that's where I wanted to conclude today. 2 weeks ago, I met with the top doctor in the United States, with our Surgeon General, and talked to him about how we need happiness hygiene habits, which is basically we get people to brush their teeth, and then after that, there's no other health habits. That's it. We get people to brush their teeth and there's nothing else. What if we got them to do a 2-minute positive habit that could raise every single business and educational outcome and how long people lived for? Well, we found 5 of them. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them very quickly because I'm out of time. The first one, we found if you woke up every day and you thought about 3 new things you were grateful for that had occurred over the past 24 hours, 3 new things you were grateful for. You can do it while you brush your teeth, and you don't just say what you're grateful for, but why. And you do it with your families and or you do it with your teams. People who are testing as low-level pessimists suddenly start testing as low-level optimists on average. That shouldn't happen. This is one of the genetic ones, right? You're born pessimist, you die a pessimist, that's the end of the story. That wasn't the story at all. What we're finding is 2-minute changes to humans' lives disrupt the gene and environment cycle, which means we don't have to live under the tyranny of our genes and environment. We can do 2-minute positive habits akin to brushing our teeth that could take people to actually train them to become more optimists. Do it for 6 months, turns out you become low to moderate level optimists. 4-year-old children around a dinner table who seem to be predisposed towards pessimism, you do it for 6 weeks, 6 months later, before and after school, they're testing as low-level optimists, which is life-changing. I never would have believed before this research came out that a 2-minute change to your day could literally disrupt the genetic and environment cycle so that we could be something different. That's what we have the capability of seeing now, and we've been hearing about this for thousands of years. And the last, so I went through 2 years of depression while I was at Harvard. Depression's different for everyone. For me, it was like I wandered out into a bog and couldn't remember why I wanted to get out of it. When it occurs, you start to feel like happiness is no longer a choice anymore. I don't want people to hear this idea that happiness is a choice to assume that, of course, I'm happy. I'm a happiness researcher. My wife's a happiness researcher. That doesn't make happiness necessarily easier. What we've been finding is that as we've been applying these things, I was able to walk myself back out of the depression. One of the ones we found that was so successful this is the last one, which we did out at Facebook. We had people for 21 days in a row. Every day when they got into work, their managers had them write a 2-minute positive email praising or thanking one person in their life. I know you have cell phones here. I know you have Wi-Fi connectivity. If you get a break, write a 2-minute positive email praising or text message praising or thanking one person in your favorites list. If you do it, I think it'll be one of the best things you do while you're here at the World Government Summit. And if you do it for 3 days in a row, you'll literally get addicted to it. I wrote to a high school English teacher one day, said, "You were the reason I fell in love with reading. You're the reason I wrote a book. Thank you for changing my life." Took me 45 seconds to type. Took me longer to find that woman's email address online. If you do this for 3 days in a row, for the next 3 days, your brain gets addicted to it because you spend all day long thinking about how amazing you were for writing that email in the morning. You're like, I'm the type of person who does this stuff. I actually took the information we heard at a summit and turned it into actual action. And you get these great emails back because they don't know about the 2-minute maximum rule. So they write about how great they think you are. And you're like, well, tell me more. We should hang out more. But the real value is if we all came back here 21 days from now, and I vote we do that. I don't know how to make that happen. But if we all came back here 21 days from now and we test you on social connection, the breadth, depth, and meaning of your social relationship, if you actually did this habit, everyone did, our scores would be in the top quartile, the top 25% for the world. The reason that's important is that if there's a secret to happiness in the research, the greatest predictor of long-term happiness is not your income, is not your externals, it's your social connection score. The breadth, depth, and meaning in your social relationships. And what we just told the top doctor in the United States is we found that social connection is as predictive of how long you will end up living and your citizens will end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking. We fight so hard against the negative in this world, and we sometimes forget to tell people how powerful a 2-minute positive disruptor habit could actually be within our lives. All of this research that I've been doing for a decade now comes down to 3 conclusions. Scientifically, happiness could be a choice. You don't have to just be your genes and your environment. You could actually create an inflection point by creating habits. It's a choice, but it requires effort. The second is that happiness is the greatest competitive advantage in the modern economy that we've seen. It raises every single business and educational outcome. And finally, happiness spreads. Because we're wirelessly connected, if you do this positive habit and you're so connected to the rest of the world, you're going to see those patterns actually start to ripple out throughout the people around you, increasing the likelihood that other people will choose happiness and that they'll see as change as possible. And all it takes is taking research that's only read on average by 7 people total and just bringing it to life. So thank you so much for the opportunity to get to join you here today. It was a privilege.